Hello class, this is Dr. Branch. We're going to talk about the Christian doctrine of marriage. What does it mean when we Christians talk about marriage? What do we have in mind? So to give you an idea of some of the confusion that's out there in our culture, this was the Grammy Awards show on television, January 26, 2014, over 4 years ago now. And you see these stars. This is Madonna. This is, he's the guy that did Same Love. I've just forgot his name. This is Queen Latifah. Queen Latifah was actually given the authority to marry for one day in Orange County, California. They performed this mass wedding ceremony with lesbian couples and gay couples, and they're all making this this argument for legalization of same-sex marriage. And this sort of applause and popular appeal, and people are just affirming everything they did there. You can see the crowd standing and people wiping tears away from their eyes. Isn't this good? So we are going against the trend in our culture. This is the way our culture sees things, and what I'm about to show you is a very different perspective. It's a Christian perspective that's been around for 2,000 years. So we even get down to the silly at our culture. Here is an Elvis impersonator officiating a wedding in Vegas. I have to confess, I like Elvis, but this is just silliness. So for some in our culture, marriage has been redefined. For others, it's just something where you have silly fun. Well, what do we want? First of all, let's talk about marriage and the gift of gender. And we begin by affirming the gift of gender from Genesis 1:26 through 28. God made us in His image, male and female. We're not the result of random time and chance. We're not just some sort of biological accident. So the point being, secular people call gender a social construct, but Genesis 1:26 through 28 affirms that sexuality is not an accident of nature, nor is it simply a biological phenomenon. It's part of God's plan and part of His will for His image bearers, and this is reflected in marriage. And what we're going to see is that we actually have different roles that attach to the different genders in marriage. Here's what it says in Genesis 2:18. It's not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. I want to just drive home one big idea here. Marriage is God's idea. Marriage is not a social construct. It's something God invented. So that's the main point there. And notice also the phrase helper suitable. That's eitzer kenegdo in Hebrew, like what is in front of. And sometimes secularists will say the word helper for the woman is condescending, that this is somehow putting women down. That shows they don't know the lexicon. The word eitzer is used 19 times in the Old Testament, 16 times in reference to God. So if the word is used in reference to God that often and that frequently, it is not and it can't be a term of condescension. It is a term of dignity. So the word eitzer actually dignifies the woman. And then there's the joyful exuberance when Adam sees her, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. One of my favorite quotes is from an old Puritan named Matthew Henry. And here's what he said about Genesis 21 through 23. Genesis chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. He said that the woman was made of the rib out of the side of Adam, not made out of his head to rule over him, nor out of his feet to be trampled on by him, but out of his side to be equal with him, under his arm to be protected, and near his heart to be beloved. Now that's tender, and I think that's a good take on that passage. So the next thing we want to drive home beyond these gender roles and gender-specific duties in marriage is it's heterosexual and monogamous. So in the Bible, Genesis 2 is foundational for our understanding of marriage. In fact, all the other discussions of marriage in the Bible eventually quote Genesis 1 or Genesis 2. So it's heterosexual. Genesis 1:26 through 28 clearly teaches it's one of the purposes for marriage is procreation. That can only happen with a male and a female apart from modern artificial reproductive technologies. I understand that. But in God's design, it can only occur between a woman and a man. So it's also, it's heterosexual. Genesis 2:24 says a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife. So it is a man to his wife. It's heterosexual. It's also monogamous. And again, the man cleaves to his wife, singular, and not to his wives, plural. So I'll go ahead and address polygamy very quickly. Scott Ray touches on it, but I want to say this. The crucial mistake of polygamists when they try to handle the Bible is this. They confuse the didactic passages with the narrative passages. And when you look at what the didactic passages in the Bible say, when the Bible is giving a teaching about marriage, all the teaching passages assume monogamy. You find references to polygamy. There is a couple of references in the Old Testament law, but generally these references are in the narratives. And I would challenge you to find one of those passages where polygamy is described as having a good outcome. The family dynamics are always messed up, always broken, there's always tension. None of these are healthy relationships. So Proverbs 5:18 encourages a husband to rejoice in the wife, singular, of his youth. It's a great phrase. The idea is the wife of a man's youth is his first wife and his only wife. The woman that I married when I was young is still the woman to whom I'm going to be married to when I'm older, and there will be no others. There's no polygamy. So we're going to scoot on past that for time's sake. So first of all, marriage as a covenant. Again, we're reiterating the point that marriage is God's idea, not merely a social construction. And so Genesis 2, we've already established, affirms heterosexual and monogamous marriage. And the desire to get married is God-given. If we're going to understand marriage as a covenant, we have to first look at God. God is the ultimate covenant keeper. And if we want to know what it means to treat marriage as a covenant, then we can look at how God has kept his covenants and how he keeps his covenant of salvation with us every day in the new covenant. So as his followers, we should have the same approach to covenant marriage. Now, when you get down to the specifics in Genesis 2:24 and 25, there's a couple of words you need to know and pay attention to. First is the word leave, and the second is the word cling or cleave. These are terms commonly used in the context of covenant, indicating covenant breach or fidelity. Now, the word covenant itself is not in Genesis 2:24 and 25, but those words leave and cleave are covenant terms. I'm absolutely convinced that the original audience, when they read Genesis 2:24 and 25, looked at those terms and they said, oh, we know what this is. This is covenant language. They're making a covenant in marriage. So the word leave is the Hebrew word azav. It has the forceful idea of forsake. It frequently elsewhere in the Old Testament describes Israel's rejection of her covenant relationship with Yahweh. You see a couple of examples there. The word bind or cleave or join to is the word dabak, and this word often designates the maintenance of the covenant relationship. So what you need to remember for the final is this. The words leave and cleave or bind or join to are words used elsewhere in the Old Testament when God is making a covenant with Israel or when Israel has been unfaithful to a covenant with God. They are covenant terms very clearly. Nothing is intended to come between the husband and the wife. Let me show you a powerful way the word binds is used. Is nothing supposed to come between a sweet young couple. Now look at this. In Job 41, he's describing a creature called the Leviathan. We don't know what the Leviathan was. Some say it was a dinosaur. Some say it was a crocodile. We don't know, but it's got these scales on its back. And notice what it says, and this is Yahweh speaking. The Leviathan's pride is in his rows of scales. So it sounds like a crocodile, right? Closely sealed together. One scale is so close to another, no air can pass between them. They are joined, dabak. That's the same word in Genesis 2:24 for joined to his wife, cleave to his wife. They are joined to one another, so closely connected they cannot be separated. If you want a word picture of the sort of oneness and unity God desires in the marriage covenant for a Christian, it's right there in Job 41. So close together, no air can pass between them. One point of this application is that a covenant marriage means a husband and wife will let nothing split them apart. Also, this word dabak is used to describe Ruth clinging to Naomi in Ruth chapter 1. Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. In verse 14, she said, I'm going to cleave to you. It says she was cleaving to Naomi. And then here you see the word leave. So this is an idea of the sort of covenant. Now, this is between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law, but it's the covenant language, and there's a reason why this passage is often read at marriages. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death departs me from you, or parts me from you. This is covenant language. Ruth is making a covenant with Naomi, and these same words are used in reference to marriage. So this passage, even though it's between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, gives us a very clear picture of what God desires in our covenants of marriage. Ephesians 5:25, the picture of Christ in the church, marriage is used as an illustration of the covenant, the new covenant that Christ makes with the church. The fact that God considers marriage a covenant is strongly reinforced by the analogy made between Christ and the church and the husband and the wife in Ephesians chapter 5. I'm looking for that on the final. There'll be a question about marriage on the final. I want you to get this. So I'm going to scoot past these three aspects of leaving, and I want to move on to a couple of other passages I would point out to you, just one in particular. Malachi 2:14 very clearly calls marriage a covenant. This is post-exilic. They've returned from the Babylonian exile somewhere around 450 BC, and Malachi is fussing at the men in post-exilic Judah for the treatment of their wives. And he says, the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth. There's that wife of your youth language again. You have acted treacherously against her, though she was your marriage partner and your wife by covenant. There it is, berit, the word for covenant. So marriage is called a covenant in Malachi 2:14. So marriage is not a sacrament in Roman Catholicism. Marriage is a sacrament. It is a way of getting grace. But in fact, salvation is by grace alone through faith, and we just reject the whole sacramental system. So it's a covenant, not a contract. What does it mean to say marriage is a covenant, not a contract? What does all that mean? Let's try to talk about a few things here. First of all, a contract is impermanent. A covenant is permanent. So a contract has provisos and usually has a sunset clause. This contract is for 3 years. A covenant is meant to last a lifetime. It's permanent. So a contract, when people treat marriage as a contract, there's actually this expectation that your spouse won't sin, that as long as if they're ever anything less than perfect, I can get out of this. Whereas a covenant emphasizes forgiveness, and the expectation is at some point our spouse is going to sin in some way, and we're going to need to forgive them. Covenants involve virtue and fidelity, while personal virtue is not absolutely necessary in a contract. If you get a contract from a new phone from a cell phone provider, they don't really care if you curse or you are profane or what sort of movies you look at or your personal ethics, as long as you pay your bill every month. But in a covenant, it's very different. In a covenant, your virtue is everything, and your virtue is what you contribute to the relationship. A covenant requires relational intimacy, while a contract does not. Let's go back to the cell phone contract. You really don't have any relational intimacy to the person at the cell phone store. They're a provider. There's someone there that's just helping you sign the paperwork and making sure you get the phone with the features and the plan that works best for your lifestyle. But there's no intimacy there. But in a covenant, it requires relational intimacy, knowing each other, caring about each other, being invested in each other. In a covenant, the good of the relationship comes before my needs. In a contract, my needs come first. So again, when we're talking about a cell phone, we get a cell phone contract. What I'm looking for is the company that can give me the best deal. But in a covenant, the good of the relationship comes first. And what's good, it's not what's good for me, it's what is good for us. And I make choices based on what's good for the relationship, not what's good for me. A covenant entails holiness, and a contract does not. Stephen and Alex Kendrick, in this great little book, if you've not read it, The Love Dare, it's really a handy, good book that they put together. They said this: a person who has become holy to you has a place no one else can rival in your heart. He or she is sacred to you, a person to be honored, praised, and defended. And then finally, trust versus distrust. A covenant is based on trust. A contract, there are provisions in there assuming distrust at some point that you're not going to act in a trustworthy manner. So we pull all this together and we say, contracts are temporary and typically have a time limit. Covenants are intended to be permanent until death do us part. So marriage is a covenant and not a contract. So whom should I marry? Let me give you a few warning signs. I'm going to scoot through these quickly. First of all, let's make sure we know believers should marry other believers. Again, I stated earlier in the previous lecture, missionary dating is a bad idea. So there's no biblical concept of a soulmate, one person in the universe. The Bible urges us to find an S-O-L-E mate, not a soulmate. There's no such thing as a soulmate. And sometimes I get asked by young Christians, is it part of God's plan? There's only one person on earth that's specifically designed for me. The Bible never uses that sort of language. What the Bible talks about is finding a person of virtue, of character, another believer. But the Bible never really gets into whether or not there's one person on earth alone that you're supposed to marry. So my advice is look for a believer who's a person of character and frankly to whom you're attracted. So some warning signs to consider. First of all, he's lazy and he won't work. The way of the lazy is a hedge of thorns, but the path of upright is a highway. Secondly, he or she is a liar. Third, he or she has a record of promiscuity. At this point, I would tell you, the best indicator of how someone will act after they're married is the way they act before they're married. And if they are unfaithful and promiscuous with other people during your relationship, they're going to be unfaithful and promiscuous after you're married. Someone who's always saying, I'm a victim. One way you can listen for this is maybe you're dating a guy, ladies, and he's talking about, well, I got kicked off the soccer team when I was in 10th grade, but the coach didn't like me. And then I didn't make the basketball team in 11th grade, but the coach had it out for me. And you see the victim language, they're never taking responsibility. They are vulgar. If they use profanity and curse words, this is someone you do not want to be around, or they tell dirty jokes. They look at pornography. They check out other men or women. If the person you are dating gawks at other men or women and looks at porn, drop them immediately. Ladies, if he doesn't respect you enough to keep his eyes on you, then he won't keep his heart on you either. Ladies, he avoids responsibility. Number 8, he or she is disrespectful for other people. One of the things I would suggest is when you go on a date, how does the person you're with treat the table server? Are they rude and demanding of them? Also, how do they treat their family members? Are they respectful to their parents? And I realize in some cases their parents may not be people deserving of respect, but do they show respect anyway, even though a parent may be just a bad person? So those are some things to look for. Is he or she a hothead, someone who becomes quickly angry? Proverbs 29:22 says, an angry man stirs up strife, and a hot-tempered man abounds in transgression. Which leads to the last point I would say. He or she is abusive. If they are abusive to you now, they will be abusive to you after you marry them. Drop them immediately. There's a great deal more that we'd like to discuss, but for time's sake, we're going to stop right there. I encourage you to read the rest of the notes about marriage, especially the section on Ephesians 5, where I talk about the roles of husbands and wives in marriage.